Should we doubt the virgin birth? Here is Bart Ehrman on the MythVision Podcast saying that Mark's gospel disproves the virgin birth.
That Mark didn't tell us anything about the virgin birth because he didn't know about a virgin birth. That this is not a story that he had heard yet. It's not clear whether the story had even come into being yet.
Oh boy, it's the argument from silence.
Oh, not this again.
Once again, the argument from silence is a fallacy of weak induction that treats the absence of evidence as evidence itself. Arguments from silence are, as a rule, quite weak, and there are many examples where reasoning from silence would lead us astray. For instance, we know that Socrates was one of the most important figures living in Athens. The Greek historian Thucydides was alive for 20 years when Socrates was around, yet he never mentioned Socrates once. But that doesn't mean that he never heard of the guy. U.S. Grant never mentioned the Emancipation Proclamation despite being the leading general in the Civil War. You think he would have said something about it. Silence just doesn't equal ignorance. Mark could have omitted the virgin birth because he has other priorities that he wants to highlight, or he could assume that his audience had already heard of it. John is our latest gospel and he doesn't even mention the virgin birth, but that doesn't mean that the author was ignorant of it. The argument from silence has to be the number one bad habit of biblical scholars.
I've got to stop.
Because in Mark's gospel, you have a passage that you don't quite get it this way in the other gospels. A couple of chapters into his ministry, we're told that his mother and his brothers come to rescue him from the public eye because they think he's gone out of his mind. His mother. And so she doesn't seem to know who he is in Mark. And that's often taken as an indication he doesn't know about it, but his gospel seems to presuppose there wasn't a virgin birth because Mary doesn't seem to know who Jesus is.
Okay, so where is Bart getting this from? In Mark 3:21 we read, "And when his family heard it, they went out to seize him, for they were saying he is out of his mind." This is the English Standard Version, and many of the other translations read similarly, indicating that Jesus' own family thought that he was crazy. These family members would have included Mary, who is present in verse 31. Since Mark is our earliest gospel, and Jesus' own mother seems to think that he's crazy, obviously that means there's no virgin birth, right?
Debatable.
But there's actually some genuine dispute about how this verse should be translated. While I'm not qualified to parse out the Greek, let's take a look at the same passage in the RSV. "And when his family heard it, they went out to seize him, for people were saying he is beside himself." Note the word people. Other translations with people include the NRSV, the NEB, Phillips, Moffat, and the TEV. There's actually some debate about who is making this claim about Jesus being crazy. Was it Jesus' own relatives, or was it the scribes? Let's keep on reading. Mark 3:22 says, "And the scribes who came down from Jerusalem said, he is possessed by Beelzebul, and by the prince of demons he casts out the demons." It seems possible to me that in Mark 3:21, when it says people or they, it's referring specifically to the scribes who thought Jesus was possessed by a demon. The crowds, on the other hand, were usually generally open to Jesus and his message with very few exceptions. So when Jesus' family came down to see him, it could be to protect him from those who are misunderstanding him and could potentially become violent. After all, Luke tells us that people in Nazareth tried to throw him off a cliff. It doesn't necessarily mean that his family, including Mary, didn't believe in him. They were just concerned for his safety. This is just one interpretation, but the bottom line is that it's simply uncertain whether or not this verse refers to his mother and his brothers. But this definitely isn't a majority interpretation, so let's consider for the sake of argument that Jesus' brothers were out there because they genuinely thought that he was cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. The text doesn't say that Mary specifically thought he was crazy. It attributes this idea to the group as a whole. As in any family fight, people can be there for lots of different reasons. Mary could have gone along to keep things cool and diffuse the situation, not because she shared the brother's perspective. She'd naturally want to be wherever her son's well-being was in question. As for the brothers, we don't know when they were told the infancy stories exactly. It may have been after this point. Or it just may be the case that Jesus wasn't preaching the kind of messianic reign that they were expecting. Notice how Ehrman seems to assume that if you thought Jesus was miraculously conceived, you think he'd have the right to do whatever he wanted. But that doesn't follow. Samson was reportedly miraculously conceived and he did a lot of stupid things. We should also remember that the Messiah wasn't necessarily thought of as God in the flesh by everyone at the time, so he could still be going off the rails in their eyes even if they believed he was meant to be the Messiah. The text just doesn't exactly say what it was that caused some members of his family to think that he was crazy. Could have been a combination of some of the things that were also ticking off the religious leaders, like eating with tax collectors and prostitutes and claiming to be able to forgive sins. But it seems rather doubtful that they disbelieved because of a lack of miracles. Prior to the passage in question, Jesus had already performed miracles as an adult. After all, verse 22 is referring to Jesus' miracles. So it can't be said that the family members opposing Jesus were doing so because they didn't believe in miracles happening through his ministry, or that because there was no virgin birth. Bart is simply overreading Mark chapter 3, and I think he's making way too much about Mark's silence. I don't think that the Gospel of Mark gives us any reason to doubt the virgin birth.